Hello watch enthusiasts. Now it comes that time of the month when I would like to talk about the various vintage watches on the market at present, which are particularly good value and interesting buys for those who are interested in purchasing a vintage watch for a reasonable price. The first watch I'd like to talk about is the Seiko 5, which is a model which has become really very iconic in the Seiko lineup alongside the SKX line, for instance, which is also just as iconic. But in this case we have quite a small, very elegant dress watch with resilient characteristics and an automatic movement in-house courtesy of Seiko. But the beauty of these watches is the versatility and the variability in the models one can buy. Now they share a very similar case, though there are variations on this, with a great many dial and hand designs and styles, and of course they all incorporate the day-date function, which is again extremely useful for a modern person working, to be able to quickly assess which day of the week and which date it is, which is again a convenience really. But of course many dials from bright colours like blues and reds are available all the way through to more sedate colours such as white or black. Similarly, a great deal of different bracelet and case attachments are available, and though they all share the common placement of the crown at about 345 on the dial, they do have very different cases with sharp edges or more soft edges, from polished to brushed finishes, domes to flat crystals, and also a great many different bracelets to choose from, which all allow one to have a watch which is remarkably unique really for a mass-produced timepiece. And of course one can find various states, but these watches really are almost all available for under £60, and this is quite remarkable for an automatic watch which is very easily serviced and very cheaply serviced too. Of course condition does play a role in the pricing of these watches, from the sort of the £10 models through to the £60 models, but certainly most are available for this price point, and it really is a case of looking at the watches and establishing whether the movements are in good enough nick to buy. And this is quite easily judged by case-back photographs, which one can cross-reference with each other to establish the finish and the quality of the model in question. But generally these are extremely good watches, especially to get into the vintage buying world, to get a feel for vintage watches and how to tell them apart. Now the next watches, which I've found to be very good value on the vintage market and the used market, are vintage models from the Universal Genève company. And this is a company which was founded in 1894 and has since produced a great deal of watches which have a particularly large bearing on history, such as the Pole Router. That said, the Pole Router, designed by Gerald Gente, is a substantially more expensive watch due to this provenance. However, it's the other watches from the brand that I'd like to talk about here, which don't really get the publicity they deserve, really, considering they were a very high-end Swiss brand in their age. Now, I've found that the watches from this company offer some of the best finishing of dials and cases below the £400 mark, and even do contend with other brands up to the £500 mark, which is very impressive considering these watches are rather old, and do feature, for the vast majority, in-house automatic bumper movements, or in-house manually wound movements, which are all fairly easily serviced by an experienced watchmaker. But certainly these watches allow one to get into a market of real luxury timepieces with beautiful dials at a very reasonable price. Now one can often find these watches with very good condition movements, with similarly excellently preserved dials with applied indices and very well finished and unoxidized hands, which are rare on watches of this age. Simply because these watches were primarily dress watches, therefore they were worn mostly indoors, and weren't exposed to the elements that, say, a Tudor oyster would be exposed to on a daily basis, which means that these watches are often much better preserved than these models. Also, Universal Genève didn't tend to use plated cases, or at least I've never come across a chrome or gold-plated case from this brand. They're always steel or gold, which is very reassuring when buying a vintage watch. Of course, the beauty of this brand is there's an immense variation between different models, from very elegant and simple silver dials through to far more dark and simple black dials with some attractive patterns, all the way through to very bright blue dials, for instance, which the brand were very famous for making, all in sunburst effect or hobnail effects, to create a very attractive piece which doesn't really fit in with other pieces one could buy today, which I think certainly adds value to the timepieces. One other quirk of the brand is that a great deal of their watches had movements with small seconds, which are often difficult to find at this price point, so one has a great deal of these dress watches with heavily domed crystals and very elegant lines, with a minimalistic small seconds dial, which I think is a real buying point for a lot of vintage collectors. Certainly, I love having these sub-dials which remove clutter from the dial and give a far more symmetrical aesthetic, which I personally adore. Now, the next watch is the Omega Genève Dynamic, which is a rather interesting piece because it's a model which was produced in the 60s and 70s by Omega, and has become quite a favourite among a lot of collectors because it looks so tremendous. And it has this bizarre shaped case with this proprietary strap and bracelet, and the ones that you see on the bracelet, the bracelet is in fact removable and replaceable with a strap. But this is done in this case by unscrewing the case back, and the case is actually a monoblock design, but one has a removable case back that holds the strap in place, which is incidentally one piece that goes through the case of the watch, and can be replaced therefore with a bracelet. But these are rather interesting watches because they come in stainless steel and gold-plated versions, though the stainless steel ones are much more more sought after and also more durable due to their finish. But they feature these wonderful sunburst dials in a variation of colours, from blues and silvers through to full blue dials and full silver dials. And I've even seen some green ones, though those are far more rare. Now, these watches come with either an in-house manually wound movement if the dial doesn't say automatic, or if it does, an automatic Omega movement. And either way, you're getting a tremendous watch, though it's worth simply noting that that one does have to wind some of them. It's worth checking which one it is before you buy it, just so you're aware of the movement in it. But it's pretty obvious from the dial. But they have these wonderful hands, which are semi-sports watch hands with that typically 70s second hand, in that bright baby blue, which really is a great contrast to the rest of the dial. Though I've seen some orange second hands in these watches as well. I do find the blue ones to be the most attractive. And this watch is very much a dress watch, but works in a sort of a futuristic way, which I think few dress watches from the era do, and also with a relatively reasonable size. These watches are wearable on a daily basis, unlike certain 32mm vintage watches. In terms of the case finishing of these very bizarre cases with this sort of distorted circular shape, we have a sunburst brushing effect, which further broadens the dial and emphasises the sunburst effect on the dial to an extremely good result to create a really wonderful watch to look at. Also, these watches are available with the integrated style of bracelet, which is easily replaced with the leather strap if one simply has a case back remover. But one can buy replacement straps and bracelets for these, so there is no real concern there with regards to destroying an original strap, because more often than not the ones that you buy won't have an original strap, though it is worth asking the seller about this because it does add a certain value to have the original. But a day-date version of this watch is also available, which is far more rare but is out of this price point in terms of being good value, because these watches come in between $350 for the manually wound versions and $450 for the automatic versions, making them extremely good value in terms of buying a watch which is relatively rare and won't be seen very often, at a very reasonable price from a reputable brand such as Omega. And these watches are easily serviced, which is again a further feather in their cap, if you will, for being excellent watches to pick up on the vintage market. Now, the next brand I'd like to talk about is Girard-Perregaux, and they're a very historic brand because, of course, they are responsible for the invention of the wristwatch. And they produced the first wristwatch, which admittedly looked very similar to a pocket watch due to its shape, but was specifically designed to be worn on the wrist by deckmen and naval officers. And of course it had a cage on the front of the dial to protect it, and various things have changed, but they really did invent the general format of the modern wristwatch, which is certainly something that most brands can't offer. So in terms of heritage, they really have got a great deal behind them, which makes these offerings altogether more enticing when one considers the relatively low price points of £200 to £800. Now, at the bottom end of this price point, around the £200 to £300 mark, one finds the more simple three-hand models with either manually wound or bumper movements, though more commonly manually wound watches. That said, though, they offer really wonderful dial finishes, which in some cases do have a certain patina, but the quality of the fittings and the fixtures and the hands really is excellent. One has applied indices on the dial, along with loomed hands. Admittedly, the loom will likely have expired, but generally these watches are in fairly good condition due to their position as dress watches. They do make certain field watches as well, notably watches designed for soldiers, which tend to sit around this price point too, which tend to be more robust if that's something you're after in a vintage watch. At the higher price points, however, as one reaches towards the £500, £600, £700, £800 marks, one finds some very interesting complications from this brand, and that's really the reason why I've featured them here, because they're one of the few brands from which you can get, for example, an alarm watch or a sort of a simple GMT piece for these sorts of prices. And they are a very illustrious brand. Often these timepieces you'll find will be steel, but one thing to watch out for when buying Girard-Perregaux is that a great deal of their watches are gold-plated, so it really is worthwhile checking and being absolutely certain that the watch is steel or gold before buying it. Similarly, a good way of judging this is if the watch appears gold but has a steel-coloured case back, then more often than not it will be a gold-plated piece, because gold plating is very rarely put into case backs because it rubs off and can irritate the skin, and also sweat can often cause it to come off much more quickly than it would on the rest of the watch. That said, if one is looking for a watch from a very illustrious brand like Girard-Perregaux, then really their vintage watches are a true steal in terms of the prices that they're available for, albeit they're all primarily dress watches due to the fact that dress watches are generally less popular than sports watches, thus demanding a lower price. But if you're happy to overlook this and enjoy a smaller dress watch, then the benefits really are numerous. Now the final watches I'd like to talk about are from Longines, and this is their Ultra-Chron line. And the Ultra-Chron line is often not really represented very well in the vintage market because it's often been undermined really by the presence of the Conquest, the old Conquest on the market, which is a beautiful timepiece in its own right, but I feel the Ultra-Chron deserves a position too, because technologically it's a far superior watch to that. And this is a watch that was produced specifically to commemorate an anniversary of the brand in the 50s and 60s, and is a watch which did carry on into the 70s, but is a watch which featured a version of the Longines movements, the automatic movements, with a wonderful engraved and cut-out rotor, which in this case beats at 5 Hz, that's 36,000 beats per hour, or 10 ticks a second. And that means that you have an extremely smooth second hand, and this is a true high beat watch, which one can quite easily get between £350 and £500, which is an excellent offering considering the case finishing is superb on these models too. Now, in terms of the cases available, this definition of the Ultra-Chron really is the definition of the movement rather than the case, because the cases come in a variation of different styles, notably some much more classic 60s models and some much more flamboyant 70s models, with much smoother lines. So really it's worth looking around at the various versions available, because there are some beautiful ones out there. Though that said, it's very specific to what you are particularly after. Of course, it's worth judging the dials, but generally one will be able to find a good one from between £350 and £500, which I think makes them extremely good value, seeing as only movements such as the Zenith El Primero movement beat at this rate. Incidentally, this movement was also the most accurate mechanical movement in the world when it was released, which again adds to the history of this watch as a true lost icon, I like to think, because it was a notable and very noteworthy model in the history of timepieces. But it certainly is lost in history, as a great deal of people aren't aware of these models out there. But certainly they do hold their place, and I think represent an era when Longines was a very premium brand, rather than a simple ETA-based, Swatch-owned subsidiary of what it used to be. Now, one point to make before I come to the end of this video is that these Ultra-Chron models are available as sports watches. But that said, to pay for a diving model, which admittedly are wonderful timepieces, one does have to reach into the £1,500 to £2,000 price mark. So there really is a difference between the dress versions of this watch and the sports models, though I personally find the dress models very charming in their own way. That said, the movements are difficult to service. That's something which certainly is the case with these, because if they're not correctly serviced and prepared, they do have a habit of wearing themselves down due to their higher beat rate. But certainly Longines can service these watches fairly easily, so it's worth only going to Longines with these movements due to the scarce nature of the parts. Anyway, I'll conclude this video here, but thank you very much for watching, and do please like, share and subscribe to help the channel and enjoy more content here in future. Also, do leave your comments down below as to what you thought of these various watches, and also what you might have included on the list. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm the Watch Guy, over and out.